This war has changed the way that Iran sees Iraq. These groups are not going to go down without a fight. Now, neither the PMF leaders or the Iraqi government have the ability to control them. Their mission is no longer just to remove US troops from Iraq. Their mission is to defend the Shia, the resistance, from the US and Israel and the Gulf in the region.
The US-Iran war has spared almost no one in the Middle East. The conflict has spread across borders, nations, and waterways in and around the region. But one of the main battlegrounds in the war is also one of the least spoken about. It's not the Strait of Hormuz, Israel, or the GCC countries, it's Iraq. And while the US and Iran are reportedly close to a deal over Hormuz, tensions on Iraqi territory are only escalating. Throughout the war, Iraqi militias have been exchanging fire with the US military. They've also been firing at Saudi Arabia, with which Iraq shares a 500-mile-long border. In late July, Saudi Arabia and the United States conducted joint strikes against Iraqi militias inside the country. While both Baghdad and Riyadh have sought to de-escalate, Iraqi militias have demanded revenge. Saudi officials have since said that they expect an attack from those militias in the very near future, in coordination with Yemen's Houthi group and Iran's IRGC, or Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So, who are these militias? How powerful are they? And has the US-Iran war effectively moved out of Hormuz and into Iraq? I'm Tamara Hemani, and this is The Big Picture. Renad Mansour, thank you so much for speaking to us today. I want to begin by asking you, before we get into the details, just to give our audience a little bit of background. Who are these militias in Iraq that have been exchanging fire with both the US military and with Saudi Arabia over recent months? Where did they come from, and how did they come to amass so much power within the country?
Well, these militias, specifically the ones that have been engaging in this war alongside Iran against the U.S., Israel, and U.S. allies in the Gulf, are known as the sort of resistance factions in Iraq. They include groups such as Kitab Hezbollah, Harakat al-Nujabat, Kitab Sayyid al-Shuhada. In essence, these are, several thousand fighters who make up a bigger ecosystem of armed groups in Iraq since 2003, which became known during the war against ISIS, established as the Popular Mobilization Forces of Hashd al-Sha'bi. And they really see their role as resistance. So whereas most of the kind of militias and armed groups in Iraq have integrated into the government in one way or another, they've become political. These groups have kind of stayed on the fringes. They've stayed on the margins of the state, and they really operate transnationally. They're connected to Iraq, but they see themselves as having a bigger project, that project being alongside with Iran, extending the influence of the Shia, extending the influence of Iran and Wilat al-Faqih, which is the doctrine of Tehran, across the region. So they are today acting alongside Iran in defense of, the Shia.
As you mentioned, there are some groups which kind of integrated with the Iraqi state, part of the Popular Mobilization Forces, and others which see their role more as like resistance and, as you said, a kind of more transnational duty to Tehran. What is the current balance of power between these kind of two groups? I guess it's not as clear cut as kind of two categories. But if you had to describe kind of like the political landscape of these militias.
Well, if you look at who is on which side, certainly the big powerhouses, the Muqtada Sadrs, who many people know from the fight with the Mahdi army, or the Qais al-Khaz'alis, the head of Asab al-Haq. These are huge players, and they are part of the Iraqi government. They have access to ministries, they have ministers, they have MPs, they have all sorts of interest in the Iraqi state, where they also profit and are able to generate significant revenue, which is partly why it is in their interests to secure and stabilize the Iraqi state rather than drag it into this regional war. So both in terms of numbers, in terms of personnel, in terms of revenue, It's those factions of the PMF that are connected to the state that are certainly more significant. The resistance factions are fewer. They have less revenue. Most of their economics is through informal trade, although they do have some access and they do have some MPs and they have some connections to the state. But really, their power right now is because they have the connection to Iran and specifically the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is working with them at an operational level now to be spoilers. So the way that I would think about it, and spoilers in the region as part of Iran's retaliation for the US and Israeli attacks. So the way that I would think about it is they are fewer in numbers, but until now, neither the PMF leaders or the Iraqi government have the ability to control them completely.
We saw recently joint Saudi US strikes in Iraq, and we also saw vows of revenge from Kataib, Hezbollah, and some of these groups who argue that, this is the reason why we need guns and we can't integrate with the state. I also saw, and I wanted to get your reaction to this, a video statement from the head of the Badr organization, one such militia, which seemed to be a call for stability, for de-escalation, in a bid to kind of prevent this from escalating. So do you think, because as you mentioned, of these ties to Iran with these groups, that this war, this conflict, has the potential to escalate, or as you said, will they manage to assert some kind of control or calm?
I think the statement, the message online and aired throughout, the Iraqi TVs, and in the region by Hadi al-Amri, the head of the Badr organization, is significant. Keep in mind that Hadi al-Amri is one of the most senior PMF leaders, but he's also one of those who has moved towards the state. And what he's saying is, to those resistance factions, which they're having trouble controlling, do not respond, do not, escalate the confrontation with the US and the Saudis. We, Hadi al-Amri is saying, we as the state will negotiate diplomatically and we will, avenge the martyrs from those attacks by Saudi Arabia and the US diplomatically. And I think this is significant because it is further kind of solidifying that line between those PMF, those armed actors who are in the state, Hadi al-Amri, Qais al-Khaz Ali, Muqtada Sadr, who have all come out against it, and the resistance factions. And it is significant because, years back, these groups were very close to each other. And in some ways, they are still close to each other. I mean, you've even heard accusations in the recent war of perhaps some better groups or some better places being used by resistance factions. So it's not as clear cut to say there's a line and you have the PMF inside the state and you have the resistance outside the state. I know, for analytically speaking, this is what the Iraqi government is trying to make, is trying to present. And certainly the ambitions are that way, but really the reality on the ground is far murkier. And so Hadi al-Amri is trying to solidify that line a bit more.
Iraq's government has, as you know, come under significant pressure from Washington to really crack down on these groups, as it were, to integrate them into the state. Do you see this attempt as working, or is it just yet another promise by an Iraqi prime minister?
So first of all, I would say that this ambition to try and integrate the militias and to demobilize some of the resistance factions goes both ways. So yes, the Trump administration, certainly as part of its wider strategy to pick back or, at Iranian influence, wants governments in Baghdad and elsewhere to try and integrate and demobilize Iran's allies, certainly. But at the same time, the Iraqi government itself is incredibly anxious and concerned with the fact that it does not have sovereignty over its complete territory. The fact that it might have its foreign policy, but groups within its territory could completely turn the table upside down by shooting one rocket, firing one rocket or a drone towards the Gulf or elsewhere. So this is a big problem for the Iraqi government, as well. So the new Prime Minister, Ali Zaidi, is also looking to find a way to deal with this, because the reality is that most of Iraq's political leadership sees what's happened in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, those countries that were in Iran's orbit and had significant axis of resistance, and have been pummeled, destroyed by Israel, by the US. And they don't want Iraq to turn into another one of those areas. So they're very careful. They want to keep Iraq as insulated as possible. And they also want to have good relations with the Gulf. So it goes both ways. Now, but to answer your question, it's a tall order. First of all, the way that the Iraqi state is built, it's not a very coherent state. There's no centralized leadership structure. There's no people. There's not that many people who could actually control these groups. And keep in mind, the U.S., assassinations over the times, over the years, has actually removed any one of those leaders who could potentially bring these groups together. So the kind of decapitation attempts, rather than creating a coherent security sector, has created this type of fragmented, divided, and decentralized militia landscape in Iraq. So the deadline of the end of September that the Prime Minister of Iraq is pushing towards is kind of ceremonially meant to be at the same time when the U.S. Operation Inherent Resolve comes to an end, that being the kind of U.S. troop presence in Iraq as part of the fight against ISIS. But nonetheless, the history of trying to integrate militias in Iraq since 2003 has proven that A, it's very difficult. B, integration does, simply putting a fighter inside the government does not mean that fighter then is loyal to the government, and often will be still loyal to their political parties. And C, most crucially, these groups are not going to go down without a fight. So we have to remember the times, for example, when the Iraqi government went after the Mahdi army, and the kind of the sort of the brutal fights that we saw, especially in the south of Iraq in the 2000s. Is this government willing to fight? We've seen that these groups, these resistance groups, will turn their guns towards the Iraqi government if it goes further on this. So that's, I think, the ultimate question. These groups are saying they will not let down, they will not put their weapons down, they will continue to fight alongside the IRGC. It's about the capability and the willingness of this government to actually pursue this agenda.
I want to talk to you a bit more about that, about the willingness of this government. It was thought that the main kind of benefit of this current prime minister was precisely his lack of political experience, lack of a political base, and so he would be more manipulable. Now, when we talk about how far the government is willing to go in integrating these militias, surely at some point he will run up against entrenched interests and he will be reined in by more established interests. We heard the news of a raid last month where they had gone to, I think it was to Harakat Hezbollah al-Najaba's headquarters, and they hadn't been able to enter the compound or seize the weapons. I wonder, do you think that is a sign of things to come?
I think yes. The prime minister in Iraq has always kind of been that sort of compromise candidate, someone who is fathomable to all parties, that they could sort of agree, they could put in office, and someone who could basically pursue their interests and their agendas without pushing back too much or without trying to go after them. So that's part of this. Now, I would note, however, that even the ruling elites who put Zaidi in power, they are more interested in going after the militias now than they have been in years prior, because they are worried that these resistance factions will kind of ruin the party. I mean, Iraq, they've recently established significant control of the Iraqi state. They're benefiting, as I said, economically, politically, ideologically. They don't want to these groups to drag Iraq further into the war. Now, so that's part of it. But the bigger question is, do these groups themselves, along with this prime minister, the compromise candidate, do they have the willingness to deal with what the backlash would be? And thus far, I think it's still an open question. For example, the prime minister launched an anti-corruption campaign as one of his initial shows of force to show to the Iraqi public, but also to the outside world, that things are different under this administration. And some of the people who were targeted were actually linked to these militias. For example, one MP was an MP from Kitab Hezbollah, but before, before the police, before the security forces could get to his house to arrest him, someone had tipped them off so that there wouldn't be that awkward potential backlash. So the initial indications are this government is trying to push the envelope when it comes to how far it could go against these resistance factions, but we're also seeing a bit of hesitancy for the kind of the theater of this. The government does not want to be embarrassed, as previous governments have been when they've tried to go after these groups, and these groups have effectively shown that they are more powerful.
He's gone for more, the Prime Minister's gone for a more gradual approach, what some have dubbed kind of assets for arms, to mean kind of giving them political and economic buy-in in exchange for giving up their arms. Is that really an effective alternative to direct confrontation? Or, will eventually that not be able to continue anymore once, Washington runs out of patience or tensions grow too high in Iraq?
I think the biggest challenge for this prime minister of Iraq is one, Washington's patience, as you noted. These deadlines are impossible, and nobody really is taking them seriously. But two, Iraq is part of Iran's shadow war in response to the attacks by the U.S. and Israel. So Iraq will continue to be a battleground, which Iran and its axis of resistance, including the Houthis and Hezbollah and others, will use to coordinate responses. And as much as we hear about MOUs and deals, this war is nowhere near over. And we should expect for at least the next year or more, maybe, this sort of attrition, this attritional war between all sides. And so, as long as that is the case, the Iraqi prime minister will have to be pursuing these policies at a time of active conflict and at a time when his country is being used as a battleground. And so Iraq will continue to be hit, likely by all sides. And many Iraqis say it's the only country that's in this war that's being hit by all sides. But that's the context, right? That's the context in which this prime minister now has to try and integrate these groups. Now, on paper, integration sounds great because rather than these fighters sitting in bases linked to armed groups or political parties, they're sitting inside Iraq's national security apparatus. The PMF has a commission. They might even go into the Ministry of Interior. That's step one. And we've seen that for many years. In fact, after 2003, many of the better organizations fighters, Hadi al-Amri, who we mentioned, they went into the Ministry of Interior. The bigger question, again, as I said, is about loyalty. Will that fighter sitting in the national security agencies or in the Ministry of Interior, will that fighter be first answerable to his or her chain of command within the ministry or to the party that sits outside? And what we've seen for the last 2 decades plus in Iraq, it's the latter. These fighters might go inside, but the bigger challenge for Iraq is that this prime minister, as commander in chief, becomes the ultimate decision maker and ultimate authority for making these decisions. And I think that's the harder part, what the country is still trying to grapple with. And there's a logic to this. The political elite of Iraq, as they negotiate for power, part of it is that each group needs to have an armed section, because in the instance that they lose an election, or that they have the judiciary coming after them for anti-corruption, they need some kind of insurance. And so Iraq's rulers today see having access to arms as an insurance policy in the worst case scenario that either a Saddam type of leader returns or that an election is not as favorable.
I wonder also if this is exactly a propitious time for this to be taking place at a time where, due to the closure of Hormuz, this is a time where arguably the Iraqi government is negotiating from the weakest point of leverage economically, I guess, in trying to assert itself within the country. And, obviously it's signing all these MOUs with the US, but ultimately none of that investment will materialize if it can't stabilize the situation on the ground. So in a way, is that economic weakness because of the Iran war also factoring in to the reality on the ground in terms of the power balance?
Yes, certainly the economic weakness is a huge issue for Iraq right now. But related to that is Iraq, like many other countries that are so reliant on the Strait of Hormuz, needs to think about alternatives. And one of the alternatives for how Iraq could get its energy out might be to go through Syria or to Jordan or build these alternative pipelines. But the fact is, to do that, it needs to have good relationships with these countries, and it needs to have good relationships with Gulf countries as it tries to overcome the economic the economic disaster that it's facing by being unable to export through Hormuz. So this makes it even more challenging if these armed groups, if these resistance factions are, targeting Jordan or targeting some of these neighbors, which Iraq will become more reliant on. And so again, this is why we see a huge divergence now by some of the PMF leaders who are part of the state who want them, who want these resistance groups to cut it out because Iraq is at an existential moment from their perspective, and versus and as they try to leverage, they need this more. They need more for better relations with the neighborhood, for both the economic, and the kind of diversification and alternative pipeline. So definitely they're at a disadvantage here. And when we say that these leaders, the Iraqi leaders, are only, facing a few thousand soldiers as part of these resistance factions, they might be small in numbers, but they are also working alongside Iran. And Iran is proving to be quite resilient in its defense across the region in this war. So this is a huge challenge, I think, as the Iraqi government will have to negotiate somehow. Of course, the Iraqi prime minister went to Tehran. The Iraqi government maintains relations with Iran, but at the moment there is a tension there between the two countries.
Yeah, I want to ask you how Iran is looking at Iraq and these various militias in this war. Iraq and these militias traditionally have been something of an economic lifeline for Iran, bringing it hard currency reserves and so on. And it's kind of stayed out of previous confrontations with the U.S. This war is very different. How do you think Iran is looking at the utility of this group?
This war has changed the way that Iran sees Iraq as part of its sort of bigger strategy in the region. And what I mean by that is until this war, so even, the 2025 June war, Iran explicitly told its resistance groups in Iraq to stay out, to exercise restraint, because Iraq, as you say, was Iran's bank, and you need your bank to be stable. You need your bank to be able to continue to help you overcome sanctions. But something has changed. In this war, Iran is now using Iraq not only as a bank, but rather as a launching pad. And in doing so, inviting strikes back into Iraq and dragging Iraq into the war. And I think there are several reasons for this. One, Iran is facing an existential crisis at home. There was even talk about regime change. So the Islamic Republic, had to pursue this type of policy from its perspective, which brought Iraq into the war. B, the whole balance of power in the region is changing, and Iran's economic policies might be changing. If Iran, for example, now profits from the Strait of Hormuz, if it's able to sell its energy through the strait, the kind of maybe the reliance on Iraq is not as much as it was in the previous status quo. That is to say that a new status quo is being developed in the Middle East. Iran is a revisionist power trying to build that new status quo, and Iraq's role in it is not the same as before. So yes, Iraq will always be an important country to Iran. It shares a very long border. It also has access, it will continue to have important access to US currency, to other currencies, to fuel. It's also a massive trading partner for, there's all of these reasons. But that initial reluctance that Iran had to keep its bank stable has gone because Iran is looking for a new balance of power in the region.
I wonder then where that leaves the efforts of the Iraqi government. If the way that Iran has viewed Iraq has essentially changed? Can Washington's financial pressure, its control of Iraq's oil revenues, sanctions, so on, can it effectively push back against that, or ultimately does geography prevail? Iraq is next to Iran. Iran has these deep ties with these groups, religious, cultural, military, financial, so on. Given these existential circumstances, is there any way in which Iraq's government can chart a path of its own?
Well, there is this simple narrative that, the Trump administration and, specifically Trump's, envoy, special envoy to Iraq, Tom Barak, is looking to cultivate people like the Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi and others at this moment to finally drive Iran out of Iraq. But I would say that there are too many variables that could sort of spoil Tom Barak's vision in terms of developing a strong man who can then create a strong state in Iraq. Part of it, as you say, is Iran's influence isn't one dimensional. It's not just these groups. Iran has a very strong connection socially, economically, religiously. If you look at, for example, the funeral processions for Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader who was killed by months ago. His body, the processions went through Najaf and went through Karbala, where many people showed up, including almost the entire Iraqi government across the spectrum. So there is still there, of course, respect. Beyond that, something to look out for is this developing Shia narrative across southern Iraq. For many years, keep in mind that Iraqis have been saying they want, and Shia Iraqis as well have been saying they want Iran out. Iran barra barra. They want Iran out of their country. There is a narrative starting to creep in with this latest war. Why is it that Trump, the US and Israel seem to be attacking Shia countries, not Sunni countries? So sectarianism is starting to creep back in. This might allow Iran ideologically to develop or redevelop some of those relationships in Iraq as well. That puts the Iraqi government all of these reasons put the Iraqi government in a very difficult position. If it was just, let's military remove some of these, resistance fighters, that would be much easier than let's start to push back on our neighbor, which since 2003 has developed deep, deep connections in the foundations of the state and non-state sectors. That's a far more difficult task that neither someone like Tom Barak or the prime minister will be able to do in the near future.
Surely those sentiments will only increase if we see, for example, more strikes by Saudi Arabia and the US on Iraq. We've also seen growing tensions with Syria, where there's little love lost between the new government and some of these Iraqi militias aligned with Iran, which were involved in Syria's civil war. How do you think that narrative will affect the trajectory of its ties in the region with the GCC, Syria, Jordan, so on, some of these countries that have been hit? Do you think if they then turn their backs on Iraq, it will only deepen its dependence and relationship with Iran?
Definitely. And, just before that, when we talk about, what we're hearing in terms of this Shia victimhood developing, one of the points that's often being made is why is it that the US is okay with someone like Ahmed al-Shara, who, was, Al-Qaeda, who was this Sunni terrorist, but they're okay with him, but they're not okay with Shia leaders. So this is more and more the narratives of Shia sort of oppression that are starting to creep back that I think is important. Now, Iraq's leadership, including its Shia leadership, people like Muqtada Sadr, Qais al-Khazali, Hadi al-Amri, and others, all want to stay out of this war. They all want these resistance factions to lay down their arms because they are part of the Iraqi state. They have control. They have now consolidated their control on the Iraqi state, and they don't want to spoil it. So there is a pragmatism by the Shia elite in Iraq to say, we have something here. We don't want to risk it. We spent, the last few decades trying to centralize this power. And, they have the Shia coordination framework is the governing body of Iraq. The Kurds, the Sunnis are not as powerful as the Shia in Iraq anymore. So they don't want to ruin this. But, and part of, the further consolidation is to enhance ties with the Gulf, with Jordan, with all of these lifelines that Iraq needs when, we're talking about a war of attrition in the region, which will lead to huge crises in the energy sector, in the food sector, in the pharmaceuticals. I mean, there is a disaster already, but it will get worse and worse. So they need their allies, because anything that these resistance groups, could do could spoil what the Shia of Iraq, from the leadership perspective, have spent all of these years trying to cultivate. So they need this to work for them, which is why they're going against these resistance groups. However, as you say, if there are more attacks by the Gulf countries and by the US or Israel, which is also now present in Iraq, if there are more attacks that kill more Iraqi civilians, if the people start to really push back, that will present huge complications to what this agenda that the Shia leadership in Iraq currently seeks to pursue.
I want to ask you a very unfair question that I ask of analysts, which is always to look into the future. But if we have kind of, from what we've discussed, three potential scenarios here. One is that with significant financial pressure from Washington, we see a real motivation to crack down on these groups, and there is significant political will from that Shia elite that you described to support this. If that's one scenario. The second is that actually these groups do effectively spoil kind of these attempts at rekindling and a strengthening of the Iraqi state. Or three, we don't achieve disarmament, but we don't also achieve the contrary. We just end up in a kind of ongoing war of attrition, neither here nor there. I have a sense what you'll answer already, but from your perspective, which scenario do you see as the most likely in terms of how this power balance will evolve in the coming months?
Well, I mean, as you sensed, the easiest answer would be the third scenario. The status quo to some extent, where you'll have peaks and troughs. You'll have times when it seems like the Iraqi government is doing well. It's developing connections. It's building pipelines, to Syria and elsewhere. But that then gets spoiled by these groups. So in the near future, I guess you could say it seems like the status quo would continue in Iraq, but I would note that it's really hard to predict, because the region is going through such a profound transformation that even the kind of cop-out answer of just things will continue as they are isn't as likely as it used to be. And we need to think about all potential scenarios, including the ones that you've discussed. Iraq becoming, more and more a battleground, and more attacks from the Gulf, and the severing of ties from the Gulf. We need to seriously consider that, especially as this war drags on, which it will. And we can also consider, if we want to have some optimism in at times where we can find no optimism, an Iraqi government that is being so pragmatic that maybe this crisis presents an opportunity for them to try and develop a more sovereign country. Now, of course, that's the least likely scenario, but who knows these days?
The date which the Prime Minister set for the disarmament of these militias, even though largely symbolic, is the same as the completion of US military withdrawal from Iraq. How do you see that withdrawal fitting into this picture? Will it go ahead? Does it then change the argument that some of these militias have for retaining their weapons? How does that fit into the picture?
I think we should take this withdrawal with a grain of salt, because it's largely a procedural issue that was negotiated years ago. Effectively, Operation Inherent Resolve, which was the U.S., return to Iraq on the sort of at the request of the Iraqi government to fight ISIS. That's what this troop withdrawal is about. And the argument being made that the fight against ISIS is over. The U.S. troops can't always be there to be fighting ISIS. But also, it's also problematic to have troops there on one, objective, and then starting to do other objectives, right? So this troop withdrawal, which they've left, most of them left Iraq, Baghdad, last year, and now they're in the Kurdistan region. It's just part of a formal kind of ceremonial end of a specific mission. I don't think that this would necessarily mean that the resistance factions in Iraq will stop firing, because keep in mind that they are now part of an active operational war that's not just about the US, but it's about the whole region and as part of Iran's strategy. And so I don't think that these groups will just say, okay, we've accomplished our mission, because their mission is no longer just to remove US troops from Iraq. Their mission is to defend the Shia, the resistance from the US and Israel and the Gulf in the region. So it's a different mission, just like the US mission is no longer just to counter ISIS, but to counter Iran. So to kind of answer your question, this troop withdrawal, I think, will have very little impact on the state of affairs in Iraq and in the region.
Renad Mansour, thank you so much for speaking to me today, for sharing your insights. It was a real pleasure to hear from you, and hopefully I'll be hearing back from you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.